White officers frame. Black woman. Unaware. She's a CIA agent. The truth explodes in court. White police officers frame an African American woman, not knowing she's a CI operative. The truth erupts dramatically in court. During a late evening in a peaceful Virginia community, two law enforcement officers stopped a black woman, accusing her of an offense she hadn't committed. What was meant to be a standard traffic stop rapidly escalated into something far more sinister, a deliberately orchestrated trap. However, these officers were unaware that their intended victim wasn't an ordinary citizen. She possessed the capability to expose everything they believed they controlled. This narrative takes an astounding twist in unexpected ways, revealing a network of deception and corruption, culminating in a revelation so shocking it would devastate the entire police force from within. The evening was tranquil in Arlington, Virginia. The gentle buzz of street lamps illuminated empty walkways while occasional vehicles traveled down the vacant streets. Talia Porter gripped the steering wheel of her elegant black SUV. Her hands relaxed as she navigated through the residential area. She checked her timepiece. It was shortly after midnight. The day had been exhausting, yet she experienced a modest feeling of satisfaction. Her covert assignment in this small community was approaching completion, and she possessed everything necessary for a seamless departure. Approaching a silent crossroads, she decelerated, her keen eyes detecting the subtle reflection of a stop sign. Talia possessed an intuition for specifics, something she'd developed through years of operating as a field agent. She executed a complete stop, maintaining steady control of the wheel, then proceeded left onto the adjacent street. Shortly afterward, blue and red emergency lights appeared behind her, their brightness reflecting in her rearview mirror. The sharp sound of a siren pierced the night's silence. Talia's pulse remained steady. She was prepared for situations like this. Rather, her mind became focused, her breathing controlled. She observed through the mirror and noticed the patrol vehicle approaching closer, its headlights creating extended shadows across her dashboard. With practiced composure, she steered her vehicle to the roadside, switched off the engine, and reached toward her glove compartment to obtain her license and registration. The patrol car halted directly behind her, its lights continuing to flash. She observed the silhouettes of two officers emerging, their movements intentional. The driver, a tall individual with a prominent jaw and commanding presence, approached initially. His colleague, shorter and more robust, followed closely. Both wore the dark blue uniforms of the Arlington Police Department, their badges shining beneath the streetlights. Talia observed their identification as they approached closer. Officer Brandon Carter and Officer Mark Sullivan. "Good evening, ma'am," Officer Carter stated, his voice carrying practiced authority. He bent down slightly, directing his flashlight into her window, the beam scanning across her face and car interior. "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" Talia maintained her neutral expression, meeting his gaze without wavering. "No, officer," she responded calmly. "I wasn't exceeding the speed limit, and I came to a complete stop at the intersection." Officer Carter's lips twitched, a small, patronizing smile forming at the edges. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there," he declared. "That constitutes a traffic violation." Talia's brow creased slightly, but she preserved her composure. "I'm confident I stopped, officer," she stated, her tone measured yet firm. "If you say so." "License and registration," Carter interrupted, his tone becoming harsher. Talia provided him the documents without delay, her movements slow and calculated. She wasn't interested in unnecessary confrontation. Carter examined her papers, his eyes focusing on her license. She could sense his examination, the subtle change in his behavior as he processed her identity. "Virginia plates, local address," he said almost to himself, then louder. "You reside in this area?" Talia nodded affirmatively. "Yes." Officer Sullivan, who had been positioned near the rear of her vehicle, suddenly called out, "Hey, Carter, you should examine this back here." Carter straightened, returning Talia's documents without comment. "Remain in the car," he commanded before turning to join his partner at the trunk of her SUV. Talia's jaw tensed as she watched them through her side mirror. Sullivan was indicating something, his voice low and secretive. Carter nodded, and the two officers exchanged a look that sent a wave of concern through her chest. It wasn't fear. Talia seldom experienced that, but a sharp, instinctual alert. Moments later, Carter returned to her window, his expression now serious. "Exit the vehicle, ma'am." Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but questioning. "May I inquire why, officer?" "We have reason to suspect you're carrying illegal substances," Carter replied. His tone was sharp, almost rehearsed. Talia's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances," she repeated. "I believe you've made an error." "We'll determine that," Carter said, gesturing for her to get out. Sullivan was already positioned near the back of her vehicle, a satisfied expression across his face. Suppressing a sigh, Talia opened the door and stepped out. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if she had unlimited time. She stood with her hands at her sides, observing as Sullivan dramatically opened her trunk and pointed toward a small unmarked package sitting conspicuously near the edge. "There it is," Sullivan announced with feigned surprise. "What do you know?" "A bag of powdery substance." Talia's eyes moved to the bag and then back to the officers, her face expressionless. Internally, however, her mind was operating rapidly, recording every detail. The bag hadn't been present when she departed her residence. She was certain of it. This was a setup. Carter moved closer, his smirk expanding. "Anything you want to share with us, ma'am?" Talia's lips formed the slightest hint of a smile, a subtle, calculated expression that conveyed neither fear nor guilt. "I'll reserve my statements for the proper venue," she said. Carter chuckled, clearly misinterpreting her calm as arrogance. "Oh, you'll get your opportunity. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." As Sullivan moved to restrain her, Talia permitted it, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You're making a significant mistake," she said quietly, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Sullivan hesitate momentarily before securing the handcuffs. "Yeah, we'll see," Carter said, escorting her toward the squad car. "Let's see how confident you remain in front of a judge." As they drove away, Talia gazed out the window, her mind already processing her options. The two officers might believe they'd just made an easy arrest, but they had no understanding of whom they were dealing with. The journey to the station was filled with tense silence. The only sounds were the engine's hum and the occasional static from the police radio. Talia sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands restrained behind her, her expression neutral. The fluorescent glow of passing streetlights created fleeting shadows across her face, but her gaze remained focused on the road ahead. Internally, her thoughts were sharp, deliberate. Every moment of the encounter replayed in her mind like a puzzle being constructed piece by piece. The stop sign that wasn't violated, the officer's confident smugness, the planted package. It wasn't simply random corruption, it was calculated, practiced. These weren't errors, they were deliberate choices. Officer Carter glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his lips forming a slight smirk. "You don't appear too concerned," he said, breaking the silence. His voice carried an edge of mockery, as if he were attempting to provoke her. Talia met his eyes through the mirror, her gaze steady, unblinking. "Should I be?" Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either courageous or foolish, lady. I've observed many people act tough, but it never persists long in the detention cell." Talia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She understood men like Carter thoroughly, accustomed to power, to manipulating rules to their benefit, to escaping without consequences. For now, she allowed him to believe he was in control. That illusion wouldn't endure. The station was quiet when they arrived, the night shift officers relaxing behind their desks, drinking coffee and conversing in low voices. Carter and Sullivan led Talia inside, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the worn linoleum floors and peeling paint of the walls. "We've got ourselves a significant one tonight," Carter announced, his voice loud and boastful. The other officers looked up, their interest aroused. Sullivan tossed the bag of powder onto the counter with a theatrical gesture. "Caught her red-handed," Sullivan added. "Appears she's been running more than stop signs." Talia remained silent, her gaze surveying the room. She noted the position of every camera, the layout of the desks, and the casual fellowship among the officers. It was a small station, the type where everyone knew everyone, a network of shared secrets and unspoken agreements. They guided her to a fingerprinting station where Carter removed the handcuffs and indicated for her to place her hands on the ink pad. She complied without a word, her movements calm and deliberate. The officer operating the station, a younger man with weary eyes, hesitated as he looked at her, as though sensing something was wrong. "Name?" he asked, his tone almost apologetic. "Talia Porter," she replied evenly. "Occupation?" Talia hesitated for the briefest moment, considering her response. "Consultant," she said finally. It was vague enough to avoid scrutiny, but truthful enough to prevent outright deception. The younger officer nodded and continued typing, his discomfort evident. Carter and Sullivan, however, were oblivious, laughing quietly as they leaned against the counter. "Enjoying the show?" Talia asked, her voice cutting through their laughter like a blade. Both men turned toward her, their smugness wavering for a split second. "You've got a sharp tongue," Carter said, his tone darkening. "Let's see how amusing you are after a night in lockup." Talia's cell was cold and dimly lit. The metal bench bolted to the wall offered little comfort. The bars cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She sat on the bench, her back straight, her posture unwavering. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the quiet corridor. Carter lingered for a moment, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You don't look like the type to get involved in this kind of thing," he said, almost conversationally. But don't worry, the courts appreciate a good sob story. Maybe they'll be lenient on you. Talia tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. Or perhaps they'll see through yours, she said, her tone calm, but edged with something that made Carter shift uncomfortably. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving her alone in the cell. Talia leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. She knew her next steps had to be precise. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was about to expose something much larger. The quiet of the cell was broken only by the faint hum of the station's HVAC system. Talia waited, her patience born of years in the field. She knew her absence would be noticed soon enough, and when it was, there would be questions. Her team would locate her. They always did. In the meantime, she had to play the part. The calm detainee, the unremarkable woman with nothing to hide, but every passing moment was another opportunity to observe, to gather information. She noted the footsteps of the night shift officers as they passed her cell, their routines and patterns. She listened for the faint beeping of the station's computers and the crackle of the radio. Every detail mattered. When the time came, she would be ready. In the station's break room, Carter and Sullivan sat back with steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter filling the small space. "She thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan said, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." "Yeah, well, that'll change," Carter replied, a smirk playing at his lips. "She's just another name in the system now. Nobody's going to investigate too deeply. Besides," Sullivan added, "we've got everything we need. The evidence is airtight." Neither of them noticed the young officer from the processing desk lingering nearby, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the holding cells. Something about the entire situation didn't feel right to him, but he kept his mouth shut. In this station, questioning senior officers wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. Back in her cell, Talia closed her eyes, her breathing steady. The hours passed, but she didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Every minute was another step closer to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The storm was coming, and Talia was its quiet center. A pale sliver of dawn filtered through the narrow, high-placed window of Talia's holding cell. The light cast a muted glow on the cold concrete walls, signaling the start of a new day. Talia hadn't moved much during the night, sitting upright on the metal bench, her eyes half closed as if in meditation. Sleep was a luxury she rarely indulged in during missions. Her mind was sharper this way, constantly calculating, anticipating. The faint hum of voices drifted from the hallway outside her cell. The station was coming to life, the day shift officers beginning their routines. She listened carefully, noting the distinct tones and footsteps, little tells that revealed more about the people working there. A loud buzz signaled the unlocking of the cell block door, followed by heavy boots echoing down the corridor. Talia didn't flinch as Officer Sullivan appeared in front of her cell, holding a clipboard and wearing his usual smirk. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. "You sleep okay? Or was the cot not 5-star enough for you?" Talia met his gaze without a word, her silence unsettling him more than he'd care to admit. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing down at his clipboard. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But, between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." She tilted her head, her expression calm but unyielding. "Good to know," she replied softly. Sullivan frowned, the confidence in his smirk faltering for a split second. He cleared his throat and stepped back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered, before turning on his heel and walking away. Talia leaned back against the wall, her gaze following him as he disappeared down the hallway. The cracks in their facade were starting to show. All she needed was a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller, young, eager, and fresh out of the academy, watched Sullivan stride through the station. Something about the whole situation still didn't sit right with Keller. He'd processed dozens of arrests in his few months on the job, but this one felt different. The suspect, Talia Porter, hadn't acted like anyone Keller had ever seen. She wasn't defiant or aggressive, but she wasn't scared either. Her calm demeanor, her deliberate words, they weren't normal. And then there was the bag of drugs. It was almost too convenient, sitting right there in the trunk like a gift-wrapped package. Keller hesitated, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He knew the unwritten rules of the station. You didn't question senior officers. But the doubt gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake it. He glanced at the surveillance monitors mounted above his desk, the live feed showing the hallway outside Talia's cell. She was sitting on the bench, still as a statue, her expression unreadable. Keller bit his lip, a tiny spark of resolve flickering within him. While Keller wrestled with his conscience, Talia made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes were trained on the camera positioned outside her cell. It was an old model, likely outdated and poorly maintained. The station's budget, she guessed, didn't prioritize state-of-the-art surveillance. She waited until the hallway was clear, then shifted slightly on the bench, her movements deliberate but subtle. Hidden in the hem of her jacket was a small, inconspicuous tracker, standard issue for CIA operatives in the field. She pressed her hand against the fabric, triggering the device with a barely perceptible click. The tracker sent a silent signal, a beacon that would reach her team within moments. She didn't need to speak or explain. They would know what to do. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sipped their coffee, laughing over the morning paper. "She's probably sitting in there thinking we're gonna crack," Carter said, shaking his head. "They always think they can talk their way out of it." Sullivan chuckled. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, and no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her." Carter leaned back in his chair, not a satisfied grin on his face. "You know what I like about this job? The predictability. You see the same types over and over. They think they're smarter than us, but they never are." Their laughter echoed through the room, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond their understanding. At a nearby office, a nondescript phone buzzed softly on a desk. A hand reached out to answer it, the voice on the other end calm but authoritative. "Signal received," the voice said. "Location confirmed. Deploying resources." Talia leaned her head back against the wall, her eyes closing for a brief moment. She could almost feel the gears turning, the quiet precision of her team mobilizing in the background. Every second that passed brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held no joy, only quiet certainty. The officers had no idea what was coming. The station bustled with its usual morning activity, officers filing reports, answering calls, and exchanging pleasantries over coffee. It was business as usual for everyone except Talia Porter and the two men who had orchestrated her arrest. For Carter and Sullivan, today felt like a victory lap. Talia sat motionless in her holding cell, her posture as composed as ever. Through the bars, she could see the edges of the station's activity, the occasional passing shadow, snippets of conversation, but she remained focused. She knew how to blend into the background when necessary, to make herself invisible until the exact moment when visibility mattered most. Her signal had been sent hours ago, and she trusted her team implicitly. But she also knew they wouldn't act immediately. Timing was critical. In the meantime, she needed to sow the seeds of doubt. At the front desk, Officer Keller's eyes darted toward the holding cell monitors again. Talia hadn't moved much since her arrival, but something about her demeanor gnawed at him. It wasn't fear or defiance. Two emotions he was accustomed to seeing in detainees. It was patience, a quiet confidence that seemed misplaced for someone accused of trafficking drugs. Unable to shake his unease, Keller pulled up her file on his computer. Her driver's license information and address were straightforward, but there was an unusual gap in her employment history. The system flagged her most recent job as independent consultant with no further details. Frowning, Keller minimized the file and glanced toward the break room where Carter and Sullivan were laughing over donuts. Their carefree demeanor made his stomach churn. Against his better judgment, Keller decided to take a closer look at the arrest report. Clicking through the digital records, he scanned the narrative provided by Carter and Sullivan. "Stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection," Keller muttered under his breath, reading aloud. "Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning, consent to search granted, controlled substances found in the trunk of the vehicle." Something didn't add up. He'd been trained to recognize patterns of deception, and while the report followed procedure on the surface, it felt too tidy, too scripted. Keller's internal conflict grew as the hours passed. He found himself pacing near the holding cells, glancing toward Talia's cell with increasing frequency. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. "Miss Porter," he said, stopping just outside the bars. Talia looked up, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. "Yes." Keller hesitated, his hand resting on his belt. I just wanted to ask, did you really consent to the search of your car?" Talia tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the faint cracks in his resolve. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. Keller swallowed hard. I'm just trying to do my job," he said, his voice faltering. "That's what they're counting on," Talia replied, her gaze steady. "Men like Carter and Sullivan, they rely on people like you to look the other way." Keller's face flushed, and he stepped back, stammering something unintelligible, before retreating down the hall. But Talia saw the hesitation in his steps, the conflict etched into his features. The seed had been planted. Meanwhile, in the heart of Arlington, a plain black sedan rolled to a stop outside a nondescript building. Inside, a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements deliberate. He was flanked by two other agents, their demeanor professional and alert. ETA on extraction? One of the agents asked as they entered the building. The man checked his watch, his expression unreadable. We'll proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch. Inside a secure operations room, live feeds from the police station flickered across several monitors. One screen showed Talia in her cell sitting perfectly still. Another displayed the front desk where Keller was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth. Looks like the kid's starting to crack, one agent observed. Good, the man replied. We'll use it when the time comes. In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, sipping his third cup of coffee. You see Keller earlier? He said to Sullivan. Kid looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sullivan smirked, shaking his head. Probably overthinking things. Fresh out of the academy. They always get jumpy around the first big case. Yeah, well, let's hope he doesn't start asking too many questions, Carter said, his tone darkening. Sullivan shrugged. Doesn't matter. The evidence is all there and she's got no alibi. Even if he gets nosy, there's nothing he can prove. Carter nodded, but a faint flicker of unease crossed his face. For the first time, he considered the possibility that Keller's doubts could be contagious. As the day wore on, the tension in the station began to rise. Talia could feel it, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. She knew her team was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Keller's footsteps echoed down the hall again, slower this time. He paused outside her cell, his expression conflicted. You said they're counting on people like me? He said quietly. What did you mean by that? Talia's gaze was steady. You know exactly what I mean, she said. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Keller stared at her for a long moment before walking away, his shoulders tense. Back in the operations room, the suited man watched Keller's retreat on the monitor. A faint smile crossed his lips. He's close, he said. One of the agents glanced at him. And then, the man's smile widened. Then we turn this whole thing upside down. Keller sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the edge as he stared at his monitor. The digital file on Talia Porter remained open, the words blurred as his mind churned. He felt a knot forming in his chest, a sensation that had been growing since the arrest. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He glanced toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were still laughing, their carefree attitudes grating against his unease. The station felt heavier than usual, the walls pressing in like a silent witness to something unspoken. Keller's thoughts wandered back to the holding cell, to Talia's words. That's what they're counting on. Her voice had been calm, deliberate, as if she knew exactly what buttons to press. And maybe she did. But was she wrong? As the hours dragged on, Keller's doubt turned into quiet resolve. He needed answers, but he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. His reputation as a rookie already made him a target for teasing. Any signs of insubordination could isolate him further. He waited until Carter and Sullivan left the room, then slipped into the records archive. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. Keller logged into the system, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for past cases tied to Carter and Sullivan. Their names popped up repeatedly, attached to arrests that followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges. Most of the defendants were people of color. Most were convicted. The knot in his chest tightened. Back in her cell, Talia remained still, her body a picture of composure. She had spent years training her mind to thrive in moments like this, when the waiting was long and the stakes were high. Through the bars, she watched Keller's shadow move past her cell, his pacing slower now, his steps more deliberate. She could sense his conflict, the internal war waging within him. He was close, she knew, close to breaking the cycle of blind loyalty that men like Carter and Sullivan relied on. She shifted slightly on the bench, letting her movements catch his attention. He stopped, turning to face her. Officer Keller, she said, her voice soft but commanding. He hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the wall as if it were a lifeline. What? He asked, his voice low, almost defensive. You've seen something, haven't you? She asked, tilting her head. Something that doesn't add up. Keller swallowed hard. I can't. He stopped, his voice catching. I'm just trying to do my job. And what is your job? Exactly? Talia pressed. To follow orders? To look the other way when you know something's wrong? Keller's jaw tightened, his eyes darting down the hallway. You don't understand how things work around here, he said. I understand more than you think, Talia replied, her gaze unwavering. I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think you don't have a choice, but you do, Keller. You always have a choice. Keller walked away, but her words followed him like a shadow. He returned to his desk, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He stared at the list of cases tied to Carter and Sullivan, his stomach twisting with each new name he read. Finally, he made a decision. Keller opened a secure email channel and typed a message, his fingers moving faster as his resolve solidified. He attached the case files he had found along with a note. To whom it may concern, there's something wrong in this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help. He hit send, his heart pounding as the message disappeared into the void. He didn't know who would receive it or if they would even care, but it was the first step toward doing what he knew was right. In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup resting on his knee. You notice Keller acting weird today? He asked, glancing at Sullivan. Sullivan shrugged. Kid's always weird. What's he gonna do, rat us out? Carter smirked, but his eyes narrowed. Still, keep an eye on him. Last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong. That afternoon, as the station hummed with activity, a nondescript black sedan pulled into the lot. Inside the car, Talia's team prepared for their next move. They had intercepted Keller's email exactly as planned, and now they had what they needed to proceed. Let's make this clean, the team leader said, adjusting his tie. No unnecessary disruptions. We need to expose this from the inside. As they stepped out of the car, the sun glinted off their badges. FBI. Inside her cell, Talia smiled faintly as the door to the station opened and the agents walked in. She couldn't see them from her vantage point, but she didn't need to. She knew her team had arrived. The storm was no longer brewing, it was here. The hum of the station fell into an awkward silence as the front doors opened. The agents stepped inside, their movements measured, their black suits crisp and their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The one in the lead, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, approached the front desk, his eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. Officer Keller, seated nearby, froze mid-typing. His heart began to race. He wasn't sure if it was fear or relief, or both. He watched as the lead agent leaned slightly over the desk, speaking low enough that the surrounding officers couldn't hear. The desk sergeant, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, straightened up, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio on his shoulder. What's this about? He asked, his voice wary. Federal investigation, the agent replied, his voice steady and clipped. We need access to your records and holding cells immediately. The sergeant hesitated, his brow furrowing as he exchanged a glance with a nearby officer. The FBI's sudden arrival was unusual, disruptive even, but there was no protocol for outright denial. Fine, he muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. Follow me. From his desk, Keller watched the exchange, his palms slick with sweat. He knew deep down that the email he'd sent had triggered this, but he hadn't expected a response so soon or so visible. His gaze flicked toward Carter and Sullivan, who were standing near the break room door. Their laughter had died, replaced by hushed whispers and furrowed brows. Carter's eyes locked onto Keller's for a split second, and the rookie quickly looked away, focusing on his screen. The air in the station had changed, thick with a tension that felt almost suffocating. Agent Daniel Price, the lead investigator, stepped into a small, dimly lit interrogation room with his team. A second agent rolled a cart carrying a portable server and several hard drives. They wasted no time plugging into the station's network and beginning to sift through its digital archives. Price leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching as lines of code and file names scrolled across the monitor. Anything? He asked. The tech agent, a younger woman with sharp eyes, nodded. Plenty. Their case files are riddled with inconsistencies, repeated arrests, identical narratives, gaps in procedure. This isn't just bad policing, it's systemic. Price's jaw tightened. Pull everything. I want every record, every report, and every piece of evidence tied to those two. In her cell, Talia heard the faint murmur of activity beyond the hallway. She could feel the shift, the subtle ripple that signaled her team's presence. The waiting was almost over. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands resting on her lap. The cuffs she'd worn earlier had left faint red marks on her wrists, but she didn't pay them any mind. Her focus was on the moment ahead, the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden. In the break room, Carter paced back and forth, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Sullivan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching his partner with a growing sense of unease. You think this is about her? Sullivan asked finally, his voice low. Carter stopped, glaring at him. Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here? Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. You think they know? Carter scoffed, but there was no conviction in his voice. Know what? There's nothing to know. Everything we did was by the book. Yeah, Sullivan muttered. Sure. Agent Price emerged from the interrogation room, flanked by two other agents. He carried a folder filled with printed reports, the weight of evidence in his hands. He made his way through the station, his expression unreadable, and as he approached the bullpen, his gaze locked onto Carter and Sullivan, who froze mid-conversation. The agents moved with purpose, positioning themselves like sentinels around the room. Officers, Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan, Price said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. We need to speak with you. Carter tried to play it cool, forcing a smirk as he stepped forward. What's this about? He asked, his tone casual. We've got nothing to hide. Price didn't blink. Good. Then you won't mind answering a few questions. The room fell silent as the agents led the two officers toward the same interrogation room they had occupied moments earlier. Keller watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding. He could see the cracks forming in Carter's facade, the tension in Sullivan's shoulders. The once confident duo now looked more like cornered animals. Minutes later, another agent arrived at Talia's cell. The door buzzed open, and the agent stepped inside, his face neutral, but his tone respectful. Miss Porter, he said, you're free to go. Talia stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly as she stepped out of the cell. The hallway seemed brighter now, the oppressive weight of the station lifting as she walked toward the front desk. As Talia passed by Keller's desk, their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, the words caught in his throat. She stopped, turning to face him fully. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice carrying an unspoken understanding. Keller's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. The interrogation room doors closed behind Carter and Sullivan, and the sound of raised voices soon followed. Talia watched from the station's entrance as the agents methodically dismantled the officers' lies. The storm she had waited for was finally here, and it was only the beginning. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Carter and Sullivan sat at a small metal table, their postures stiff. Agent Price stood across from them, his hands resting on a stack of documents. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. So, Price began, his tone measured, do you want to start with the arrest report, or should we jump straight to the planted evidence? Sullivan flinched, his eyes darting toward Carter. We don't know what you're talking about, Carter said firmly, his voice laced with defiance. Price didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the folder, pulling out a series of printed photos. He slid them across the table one by one. Images from the station's security cameras showing Carter and Sullivan handling the unmarked bag before Talia's car was searched. Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. That doesn't prove anything, he said. We were securing evidence. Price raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. Really? Because these timestamps show otherwise, and we have audio recordings, courtesy of Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device capturing your little conversation about how easy it would be to frame her. Sullivan paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You can't use that, he sputtered. That's entrapment. Price smirked, shaking his head. No, it's justice, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. We've pulled records from your past arrests, dozens of cases with eerily similar patterns. All of them are under review. But let me make one thing clear. You're not walking out of here today. Carter's bravado began to crumble, his shoulders sagging. Sullivan buried his face in his hands, the weight of their actions finally hitting him. Meanwhile, in the bullpen, Keller sat at his desk, watching the scene unfold. He had been called into the interrogation room earlier to confirm details about the station's processes. For the first time, he felt the heavy gaze of Carter and Sullivan as they realized someone from within had spoken out. As the agents returned to the bullpen, Keller stood, his hands trembling slightly. He approached Agent Price, clearing his throat. What happens now? He asked. Price looked at him, his expression softening slightly. Now, we clean house, and you. He paused, studying Keller's face. You did the right thing. Keller nodded, a small wave of relief washing over him. For the first time since joining the force, he felt a sense of purpose. Talia stood near the station's entrance, watching as Carter and Sullivan were led out in handcuffs. The once smug officers now looked defeated, their eyes downcast as they were escorted past their colleagues. The station buzzed with quiet murmurs, officers exchanging stunned glances as the reality of the situation sank in. Agent Price approached Talia, his expression neutral but respectful. We've got everything we need, he said. Your work here is done. Talia nodded, her composure unbroken. Good. Make sure it sticks. Price smiled faintly. It will. As Talia stepped outside, the crisp air hit her face, carrying with it a sense of finality. The weight she had carried for weeks began to lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing justice had been served. In the days that followed, the fallout from the investigation sent shockwaves through the town. Carter and Sullivan's arrests were headline news, their faces plastered across every screen. The charges against Talia were formally dropped, and the cases tied to the officers' misconduct were reopened. The station underwent a massive overhaul, with several officers resigning under scrutiny. Keller, now viewed as a whistleblower, received mixed reactions from his colleagues, but he held his head high, knowing he had made the right choice. Weeks later, Talia sat on a park bench, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The autumn leaves rustled around her, their vibrant colors a reminder of change. She had returned to her quiet life, her mission complete, but the experience lingered in her mind. Agent Price joined her, his presence a rare moment of camaraderie. "You could have handled this differently," he said, sitting down beside her. Talia smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "And miss the look on their faces?" "No, thanks." Price chuckled softly. "You've got a knack for making things memorable." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. For Talia, the storm had passed, but the impact of her actions would ripple on, ensuring that justice prevailed, at least for now. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of Carter and Sullivan's arrest, every local and national outlet had picked up the story. "Police corruption exposed, FBI takes down dirty cops in Arlington," read the bold headlines on one major news site. Footage of the officers being led out in handcuffs played on a loop, their faces grim, stripped of the arrogance they had worn so openly. Talia Porter's name was kept out of the media intentionally, a calculated decision by her team. The focus needed to remain on the systemic issues at the station and the actions of the officers involved, not on her role in uncovering the truth. She preferred it that way. She had no interest in fame, only results. In a sterile, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Carter and Sullivan sat across from their lawyers. Their arrogance had melted into desperation, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. The charges against them were overwhelming, falsifying reports, planting evidence, and abusing their authority in dozens of cases. "This is bad," Sullivan muttered, his voice shaking. "They've got everything. Audio, video, the files. What do we do?" Carter, usually the more confident of the two, sat in silence. His jaw clenched. "We fight it," he said finally, though the conviction in his voice was weak. But their lawyers weren't optimistic. The mountain of evidence was insurmountable, and public outrage had already tipped the scales against them. Plea bargains were their only chance of avoiding decades in prison. Back at the Arlington Police Department, the fallout continued. Internal investigations revealed more officers involved in similar practices, and resignations poured in as higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police held a press conference, emphasizing a commitment to transparency and reform, but the damage to the department's reputation was already done. Keller found himself at the center of attention, both praised and ostracized for his role in bringing the corruption to light. Some colleagues avoided him, their loyalty to the old guard still intact, while others quietly expressed their support. Keller didn't care. He had done what was right, and that was enough. A week after her release, Talia met Keller in a small diner on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos they had both endured. Keller sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," he admitted, his voice low. Talia raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You earned this conversation," she said. "Not many people would have done what you did." Keller looked down at the table, his expression conflicted. I couldn't keep looking the other way," he said. "But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess, and people like Carter and Sullivan, there are more of them out there." "It made a difference to the people they hurt," Talia replied firmly. "And it made a difference to you. Don't underestimate that." Her words seemed to ease some of his tension, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. "What about you?" he asked. "What happens now?" Talia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Now, I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight." Months later, Carter and Sullivan stood in court, their fates sealed. They pled guilty to multiple charges, each receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Their careers were over, their reputations destroyed. For the first time, they faced the consequences of their actions. The cases they had built on lies were overturned, and innocent people were exonerated. Community leaders rallied for deeper reforms, using the scandal as a catalyst for change. In a quiet moment, Talia sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, filled with details of her next assignment. She glanced at it briefly before closing it, her mind already focused on the road ahead. The phone on the counter buzzed, and she picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. "Ready for the next one?" Talia smiled faintly. "Always." As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, The door clicked shut behind her. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, not for the people she worked to protect, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served and the truth had prevailed, and that, for her, was enough. And so the truth came to light and justice was served. The corrupt officers who thought they could get away with their crimes faced the consequences of their actions, while the woman they tried to frame emerged victorious, stronger than ever. This story reminds us that no matter how deep the lies, the truth will always find a way to shine through. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps bring these stories to life. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.